Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. Jake never expected to come home to this. As he pulled into his driveway, something felt off. The usual quiet hum of the neighborhood was broken by the sound of thumping bass and an off-key instructor shouting commands. He barely had time to process it before he hit the garage door opener, and what he saw nearly made him choke on his coffee. 15 people in bright neon leggings were jumping, spinning, and sweating all over his garage floor. A full-blown Zumba class in his garage. For a moment, Jake just stood there blinking. Did he walk in the wrong house? No, his workbench, his tools, even his bike hanging from the ceiling were right where he left them. But instead of a quiet, functional space, it had been transformed into a makeshift dance studio. His brain struggled to keep up. Then he saw her, Karen. She stood front and center in a pink tracksuit, arms folded, smirking like a queen surveying her kingdom. The self-proclaimed dictator of the HOA, the one who loved rules, her rules. The moment their eyes met, she stepped forward and clapped her hands. "Oh, good, you're here," she said as if she had invited him into his own home. "We just finished up our warm-up. Why don't you come back in an hour?" Jake's pulse spiked. "Come back? Karen, this is my garage. What the hell is going on?" Karen rolled her eyes, turning to her class with an exaggerated sigh. "Ladies, we have a complainer. Just ignore him. He'll get over it." Jake was still trying to process how this was even happening when one of the women loudly cleared her throat. A tiny older lady in a bright purple leotard glanced over her shoulder at him. "Sir, can you move? You're blocking the airflow." Jake's eye twitched. He turned back to Karen, his voice sharp. "Karen, explain now." Karen gave him a patronizing smile, the kind that made his blood boil. The HOA voted to repurpose underutilized spaces for community activities. She gestured around the garage, as if presenting some grand design marvel. "This was the best option. It's so roomy, perfect for our fitness program." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What vote? I never voted for this." Karen's smirk didn't falter. "Oh well, you weren't there." Jake clenched his fists, inhaling through his nose. "That's because no one told me." Karen shrugged. "We put up a notice." Jake narrowed his eyes. He knew damn well there had been no notice. "You can't just take over my garage, Karen. This is my property." "Oh, don't be dramatic." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's still technically yours. We're just sharing it." His patience snapped. "Get out now." Karen's face twisted. "Excuse me? You heard me. This isn't a public space. It's my garage, and you and your class are trespassing." A few of the women exchanged uneasy glances, realizing Jake was actually serious. But Karen wasn't backing down. Instead, she straightened, eyes flashing with that self-righteous authority she loved to wield. "Well, if you have a problem with it," she said, all smug and condescending, "I guess we'll have to call security." For a second, Jake almost laughed. "Security? What? Ted from 3 houses down?" Before he could respond, Karen whipped out her phone and, with exaggerated flair, started dialing. Jake stared at her, then at the group still dancing in his garage, and realized something. This wasn't just a one-time thing. Karen had no intention of stopping, and if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was going to get worse. He watched as she spoke into the phone, shooting him a smug glance before hanging up. "Security's on their way," she chirped. "You might want to rethink your attitude." Jake exhaled a slow, dangerous breath. Fine. She wanted a fight. She just got one. Less than 5 minutes later, security, or rather Paul, a middle-aged guy with a clipboard and an ill-fitting vest, showed up at Jake's doorstep. Karen immediately launched into a dramatic retelling of the events, claiming Jake was interfering with community activities and disrupting neighborhood harmony. Paul, clearly uncomfortable, turned to Jake. "Listen, man, Karen says there was an HOA vote." "There wasn't." Jake interrupted, arms crossed. Karen scoffed. "It was unanimous." Jake's voice was flat. "Who voted?" Karen smiled brightly. "Me and the other board members." "That's not unanimous," Jake deadpanned. Paul shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was way above his pay grade. Karen crossed her arms. "Jake, don't be difficult. Just let us use the garage. It's for the community. Jake's jaw clenched. He could feel it. This wasn't going to end with a conversation. Karen had already decided she owned his garage, and from the way she stood there, hands on her hips, smiling like she'd already won, she thought he'd back down. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Fine. She wanted his garage for community fun. He'd make sure she got exactly that. Later that night, Jake sat at his desk, laptop open, a wicked grin stretching across his face. Karen wanted to turn his garage into a dance studio? Fine, but tomorrow she'd regret it. Jake woke up the next morning feeling oddly excited. Last night, he had changed the locks on his garage and double-checked the security footage. If Karen and her army of spandex warriors tried to get in again, they'd be in for a surprise. He brewed his coffee and sat by the window waiting. Sure enough, at exactly 8 a.m., he saw them marching up his driveway, Karen leading the charge like a general heading into battle. She reached for the garage door handle and yanked. Nothing. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, enjoying the show. Karen's expression shifted from smug confidence to absolute confusion. She tried again, jiggling the handle. When it didn't budge, she turned to one of the women in her class, eyes narrowing. "Did one of you mess with this?" They all shook their heads. That's when Karen's face contorted with rage. She whipped out her phone and, with the dramatic flair of someone way too invested in their own importance, called Jake. His phone buzzed. He let it ring. Her head snapped up toward him. Jake smiled, lifted his coffee and a little mock toast, and took a sip. Karen hung up, then stormed to his front door and started pounding on it. "Jake, open this door." He casually strolled over and cracked it open just a sliver. "Can I help you?" Karen was seething. "Why is the garage locked?" Jake blinked. "Because it's my garage." She gasped, as if he had just committed an unforgivable crime. "You are obstructing an approved community activity." He leaned against the doorframe. "I don't recall approving anything." "The HOA," she screeched. Jake let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. "You mean you and your little board of minions?" Karen's eyes flashed. "You have 2 minutes to open that garage, or you're getting fined." Jake had to stop himself from laughing. "Oh yeah? And how much will that cost me?" Karen, without hesitation, snapped, $500. Jake burst out laughing, which only made her madder. "You think this is funny?" "Yeah. Actually," he said, wiping a fake tear from his eye. Karen whipped out a clipboard, because of course she had a clipboard, and furiously scribbled something down. Then she ripped the paper off and shoved it against his chest. "Fine notice," she snarled. "You have 24 hours to pay, or it doubles." Jake took the paper, glanced at it, and smirked. So this is illegal?" Karen froze. Jake pointed at the tiny fine print at the bottom of the notice. "You do realize under HOA bylaws you need an official homeowner vote before enacting fines over $100, right?" Karen's eye twitched. "We don't need a vote when the board agrees." "Actually, you do," Jake grinned. "And since you love rules so much, you should probably follow them." Karen snatched the paper back, shaking with anger. "This isn't over." She stormed away, heels clicking against the pavement, her Zumba warriors trailing behind. Jake watched them go, shaking his head. That was too easy, or so he thought. 2 days later, he woke up to an official-looking envelope taped to his door. The letter inside was written in the most aggressively passive-aggressive legalese imaginable. "Dear homeowner, due to repeated violations of community guidelines, your property has been designated for mandatory compliance inspections. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in further action. Sincerely, the HOA Board." Jake rolled his eyes. This wasn't just a fine anymore. Karen was trying to strong-arm him into submission. That afternoon, he checked his security cameras and, sure enough, caught Karen and 2 of her lackeys snooping around his garage. She tried the handle again, still locked. Then she did something completely insane. She pulled out a set of bolt cutters. Jake couldn't believe it. Was she seriously about to break into his garage? Before she could, one of her minions whispered something nervously, making Karen pause. With an exasperated sigh, she shoved the cutters back into her purse and stormed off. Jake watched the footage twice just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. This woman was actually willing to commit a crime over a exercise class? Fine. If Karen wanted to break the rules, she was about to see just how much fun breaking the rules could be. That night, Jake got to work. He ordered something special, something that would turn his garage into the last place Karen would ever want to be. It arrived the next morning in a giant crate, a commercial-grade industrial foam machine. If Karen thought she could use his space for free, then fine, he'd give it to her, but she'd better bring a swimsuit. The next morning, Jake left the garage wide open. He even left a little note taped to the door. "Welcome to the new community event, Jake." At exactly 8 a.m., Karen and her crew stormed in like they'd won some great victory. Karen strutted inside, arms crossed, grinning like she had personally defeated a great enemy. "I'm so glad you finally came to your senses, Jake," he just smiled. Then he pressed the button. The foam machine roared to life. Within seconds, a tsunami of white, fluffy soap bubbles exploded out of the walls, covering everything. Karen's smug expression vanished. The dancers screamed as the foam rushed over their feet, then their knees. Within seconds, the entire garage was a frothing, chaotic mess. Jake stood outside watching the chaos unfold through the garage cam, crying with laughter. Karen slipped face first into the foam, her pink tracksuit soaked and clinging to her like a wet cat. Some of the women tried to escape, but the foam kept coming. Karen finally stumbled to her feet, shrieking, "Jake, turn it off." He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Oh, but Karen, this is a community event." The entire street had gathered outside, watching, recording, laughing. Even a mailman stopped to take a video. Jake could see it now. HOA Karen gets owned by giant foam explosion. Viral content. Karen, dripping and fuming, tried to march through the foam but slipped and face-planted again. Jake smiled. Karen wanted his garage. She got it, and this was just the beginning. Jake could barely contain his laughter as the foam continued to billow out of the garage, swallowing everything in sight. Karen flailed wildly, her pink tracksuit now completely soaked and clinging to her like a second skin. The other Zumba warriors weren't faring much better. Some had managed to wade through the foam toward the exit, while others were still slipping, tumbling, and shrieking in complete chaos. The entire scene was absolute perfection. From the sidewalk, a growing crowd of neighbors had gathered, phones out, capturing the absolute disaster that was unfolding in real time. "Oh my God," someone chuckled. "That's the best thing I've seen all year." Even a mailman had stopped his route to record, holding up his phone with a huge grin. Jake leaned casually against his car, taking in the mayhem. Karen finally fought her way to the entrance, foam still clinging to her face, eyes burning with pure rage. "Turn it off," she screeched. Jake tilted his head. "But Karen, I thought this was a community space. I'm just adding to the experience." She let out an inhuman shriek and tried to charge toward him, only for her foot to slip again, sending her toppling backward into the foam. The crowd erupted in laughter. Jake casually pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. "Perfect for the HOA newsletter," he mused. One of the Zumba ladies, a woman in her late 50s with a bright purple headband, walked over toward Karen, looking more amused than anything. Karen, I think we should maybe move the class somewhere else," she suggested. "No," Karen hissed, spitting out foam as she climbed to her feet again. "We are not leaving. He's violating community standards, and I will not be bullied out of my own event." Jake grinned. "Oh, so we're still doing the class." Karen shot him a death glare. She turned toward the remaining dancers, half of whom had already started making their way out of the foamy mess, too embarrassed to continue. "Everyone stay. We're not backing down. This is our space." Jake folded his arms. "All right, suit yourself." He reached into his pocket and cranked the foam machine to max whoosh. The garage completely disappeared in a storm of thick white foam. The entire floor was now one giant slippery clap. Karen let out a horrified gasp as she was immediately swallowed by it. More shrieks and laughter erupted as the remaining Zumba dancers fought their way out, looking like drenched, confused marshmallows. Jake watched, completely unbothered. "Guess the HOA should have checked the fine print before claiming my garage." A chorus of chuckles rippled through the crowd. Karen finally crawled out of the mess, breathing heavily, her once neat blonde bob plastered to her forehead. Her face was a mix of fury and pure humiliation. "You think this is funny?" she bellowed, pointing a trembling, foam-covered finger at Jake. He shrugged. "You did say this garage was for community events. I just made it more fun." Her eye twitched violently. "This is war." Jake smirked. "Then you better bring reinforcements, Karen." The crowd burst into applause as Karen stormed away, foam dripping from her clothes, muttering a string of furious curses. But Jake wasn't done yet. He turned to the neighbors, all still watching with grins on their faces. "So who wants to turn this into a real foam party?" A cheer erupted from the crowd. Within minutes, Jake had turned on music, set up drinks, and cranked up the foam machine again, this time for an actual party. Neighbors poured in, laughing and dancing, taking turns slipping around in the foam like kids at a water park. Someone brought out a couple of pool floaties, and someone else brought a full-blown speaker system. Before Jake knew it, his entire driveway and garage had transformed into the most legendary HOA block party in history. Karen could only watch from her window, seething with rage as the community cheered Jake on. And just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, the videos went viral. Jake woke up to dozens of notifications buzzing on his phone. The foam party had gone viral overnight. Tips of Karen. Slipping, screeching, and flailing in the sea of bubbles were all over TikTok, Twitter, and Reddit. HOA Karen versus the foam machine. Guess who won? This guy just defeated his HOA with a bubble cannon. The funniest HOA meltdown ever caught on camera. Jake scrolled through the comments, laughing at the sheer volume of people absolutely roasting Karen. She really tried to steal your garage, and now the internet is making her pay rent in embarrassment. She thought she was the final boss, but my guy just hit her with the ultimate counter. It was glorious. Then reality hit. A loud pounding on his door made Jake groan. He already knew who it was. With a smirk, he grabbed his coffee and casually opened the door. Karen stood there, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her face was red with pure rage, and in her hand, she clutched a thick folder of papers. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jake took a slow sip of his coffee. "Made the neighborhood more fun, Karen," he replied. "You've humiliated me. My daughter saw that video. My friend saw that video. I am a respected figure in this community." Jake had to physically stop himself from laughing. Karen shoved the folder against his chest. "Well, enjoy your little joke because I'm suing you." Jake raised an eyebrow. "For what? Defamation? Property damage? Why violating?" Jake flipped open the folder. It was a printed out legal notice, but something about it felt off. "You wrote this yourself, didn't you?" Karen's nostrils flared. "I have every right to demand legal action." Jake skimmed through the absolute nonsense she had written. One section read, "Mr. Jake maliciously and intentionally deployed hazardous foam weaponry, endangering community members and creating an unsafe environment for exercise and wellness." He snorted. "Karen, did you just call my foam machine a hazardous weapon?" She ignored him and pointed an accusatory finger. "And thanks to you, the HOA board has called an emergency meeting. If I were you, I'd start packing my things." Jake's amusement flickered for just a second. He knew Karen was unhinged, but could she really get him kicked out? He decided to play it cool. "All right," he said, crossing his arms. "Let's see what your little kangaroo court has to say." Later that afternoon, Jake arrived at the HOA meeting where the usual group of HOA members had gathered. Karen sat at the front, smirking like she'd already won. The head of the HOA, a guy named Bob, cleared his throat. "We've received multiple complaints about last week's events," he began. "Several members have raised concerns about excessive foam usage." Jake kept his face neutral. "Excessive foam?" Karen leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Yes, Bob. You see, this individual has been consistently violating HOA policies and endangering public safety. Just look at how he weaponized his garage." Jake looked at her deadpan. "You broke into my garage." Karen scoffed. "You're making that up." Jake smiled. "Oh, don't worry. I brought proof." He pulled out his phone, tapped his security app, and played the footage right there in crystal clear HD. It was Karen and her lackey trying to break into his garage with bolt cutters. The entire room went silent. Bob turned to Karen slowly, blinking. Karen, what is this? Karen's face drained of color. That's taken out of context. Jake smirked. Oh, what's the context for attempted breaking and entering? A murmur spread through the room. Bob cleared his throat again, clearly done with this entire situation. Karen, this is serious. Did you attempt to break into his garage? Karen looked around, realizing she had no way out. Well, she stammered, he was obstructing a community activity. Bob let out a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. Karen, we can't enforce unapproved rules. We also can't allow board members to engage in questionable legal behavior. Jake leaned back in his chair, grinning. Bob flipped through a stack of documents and frowned. Actually, now that we're reviewing the paperwork, I see several unauthorized changes to the community bylaws. Jake raised an eyebrow. Unauthorized? Bob turned to Karen, frowning. You never had permission to make any of these changes. This shared space rule never passed an actual homeowner vote. Jake's grin widened. Karen's jaw dropped. Bob sighed, rubbing his temples. Karen, I'm afraid we need to discuss your position on the board. Karen shot up from her seat. You can't do this. I am the HOA. Bob shook his head. You are effective immediately. We are removing you from the board. Jake couldn't believe it. The room erupted in murmurs. Some neighbors looked relieved. Others snickered under their breath. Karen stood there frozen, like her entire world had just collapsed. Then her face twisted with pure fury. You think this is over? She shrieked, pointing at Jake. You think you've won? Jake grinned. Yeah, kind of. Karen let out a frustrated scream and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that a framed photo fell off the wall. Bob turned to Jake. Well, that was something. Jake chuckled. So, I don't have to pay that fine, right? Bob let out a tired laugh. No, Jake, you don't have to pay the fine. Jake gave a dramatic sigh of relief. Good. I'd rather spend that money on more foam. The entire room laughed, and just like that, Karen was out. Jake had won, but something told him she wasn't done yet. Karen was gone, officially removed from her precious HOA board, humiliated in front of the entire community, and turned into a viral laughingstock. But Jake knew better than to think she'd go quietly. For the next few days, things were eerily silent. No more passive-aggressive emails, no more fake fines taped to his door, no more Karen barging onto his property like she owned it. Jake wasn't stupid. She was plotting something. And then it happened. Early one morning, he stepped outside to grab his mail when he noticed something off. A for sale sign had been planted in Karen's front yard. Jake blinked. No way. Barely had time to process it before a moving truck pulled up, the door swung open, and out stormed Karen, her face twisted in fury, barking orders at the movers as they started hauling boxes out of her house. Jake watched in stunned silence for a moment before a slow, satisfied grin spread across his face. She was leaving. The woman who had tried to run the neighborhood like a dictator, who had harassed him, fined him, and tried to steal his garage was finally getting out. He couldn't resist. He casually strolled down his driveway, coffee in hand, and leaned against his mailbox. Morning, Karen, he called out cheerfully. Karen's entire body stiffened, and she turned slowly, glaring daggers at him. You think this is funny? She snapped. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee. I think it's hilarious. Her face burned red. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jake raised an eyebrow. Oh, you mean exposing the fact that you illegally changed HOA rules, tried to fine me for my own garage, and attempted to break into my property? Yeah, Karen, I know exactly what I did. She clenched her fist so tightly her knuckles turned white. You ruined me, she shrieked. Jake tilted his head. You did that all by yourself, Karen. She let out a furious noise, something between a growl and a scream, and turned back to the movers. Jake watched, deeply enjoying every second as they hauled out her overpriced designer furniture and piled it into the truck. It wasn't long before other neighbors started to notice. One by one, people came outside, eyes widening as they saw Karen's belongings being packed up. A few exchanged sly smiles. Some even whispered excitedly. Then someone clapped. Jake turned to see old Mr. Hendrick from 3 doors down, standing in his bathrobe, slowly applauding. Then another neighbor joined in, and another. Within seconds, half the neighborhood was standing outside, clapping, cheering, some even recording the moment. Karen's entire body stiffened as she realized what was happening. She whirled around, face contorted in rage. "You're all monsters," she screeched. Jake chuckled. "Nah, we just enjoy a good community event." The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen stomped toward her car, foam still clinging to her tires from last week's disaster, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut. Then she peeled out of the driveway, leaving a trail of dust and her ruined reputation behind. As the moving truck slowly pulled away, Jake turned to the crowd. "Well, folks," he said, clapping his hands together, "I think we just had our first HOA-approved eviction." A loud cheer went up. Someone popped a bottle of champagne. A few neighbors broke out into an impromptu dance party on Karen's now vacant driveway. Jake couldn't have asked for a better ending. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood was finally free. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt different. The air seemed lighter, conversations with neighbors felt friendlier, and best of all, Jake could finally enjoy his home without worrying about some bogus HOA fine appearing on his doorstep every other day. The first morning after her departure, Jake stood in his driveway, sipping his coffee in peace. No yelling, no inchitle demands, no cutting. And then the best part. The HOA board officially reversed every ridiculous bylaw she had snuck in at the next community meeting. Bob, the same HOA head who had kicked Karen off the board, stood up and cleared his throat awkwardly. So, turns out most of the rules Karen enforced were completely illegal. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. "We're scrapping the garage sharing policy, voiding all fines issued under her leadership, and let's just say this HOA is about to be a whole lot less insane moving forward." Jake leaned back his chair, grinning. "Does this mean I get to keep my foam machine?" he asked. Bob sighed. "Jake, just don't use it as a weapon again." The room burst into laughter. It was perfect. The neighborhood, once plagued by Karen's iron grip, was thriving. People were actually enjoying their homes again. HOA meetings became civilized instead of being Karen's personal dictatorship. And then the cherry on top. Jake's viral video exploded even more. The footage of Karen flailing around in the foam, the screaming, the neighborhood cheering as she moved out, it was all over the internet. It got picked up by entitled people compilations, turned into memes, even featured in a few online news articles. HOA Karen gets the ultimate in one hilarious foam party. The funniest HOA takedown you'll ever see. Jake's notifications were insane. His inbox was flooded with messages. "Dude, please tell me you have more Karen stories. This is the most satisfying revenge I've ever seen. Bro, you just inspired an entire movement against HOA dictators." Jake smirked. Maybe, just maybe, he was onto something. So he made a follow-up video. He walked through the entire saga. How Karen tried to steal his garage, how she lost her mind when he fought back, and how she ultimately lost everything. And at the end, he looked straight into the camera and said, "So tell me, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard? Drop it in the comments, because I think it's time we expose more Karens." The response was explosive. Thousands of comments poured in. People shared wild stories about nightmare HOA board members, petty fines, and revenge tactics even crazier than his foam party. The engagement was off the charts. His subscriber count skyrocketed. Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the numbers climb. Maybe this wasn't just a one-time thing. Maybe he had just unlocked something big. One thing was for sure. Karen was gone, but the HOA drama was just getting started, and Jake, he was just getting warmed up.